One.
All right, hey guys, welcome back to the Melanin Margin. I'm your host, Quaviondre Williams.
And I'm Daquon Wilson.
And this is a talk show dedicated to bringing the marginalized to the spotlight and uplift the Black voices that will no longer stay silent. But before we get into this week's race conversation, I want to talk to you guys about what we talked about a few weeks ago about the Black hair and professionalism. Now, what I want to clarify here is that we were talking about Black hair and the texture and the texture of our hair being something that should be seen as a professional environment as well. It can be used in that environment. This was not to say that people who relax their hair, get braids, get weaves, get all the other stuff are anti-Black, because that is not the case. There is no scale of what is Black and what isn't. The facts are, as long as you're doing what you want to do for your hair, that's what matters. I think that a lot of people I just want to make sure we clarify that, because I didn't want it to seem like we were saying that, oh, if you don't wear your Black hair, if you don't wear your natural hair, it's whatever. No, some people literally do not have the money to afford natural hair, bitch. It's a business. Okay,
it's expensive.
It's expensive as fuck. So I wanted to make sure we got that out the way before we got started in this episode, because there is no such thing as the only thing that is anti-Black with hair is when you changing your hair to fit into a stereotypical European or Eurocentric lifestyle, because that is something that you're rejecting your African heritage, or you're rejecting your hair. That's going into self-love and a whole nother conversation. The reality,
right. Maybe season 2 we'll get to that.
Maybe season two, but the facts are, just the basic thing that we're trying to say here is that as long as you are doing what you want to do with your hair outside of societal influences, that is not anti-Black. So now that we got that out of the way, let's get into this week's race conversation. So Daquon, what is acting white?
Some foolishness.
End of episode. Roll credits.
End of episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. No, but acting white, I honestly think is just like some social construct in terms of like, how do you act white? I think it's something that's thrown around often to degrade Black people, in terms of oftentimes you hear somebody's acting white when they're acting in some type of bougie fashion. And I use bougie in quotes, but like somebody who speaks intelligent, uses big words, they're like, oh, you're speaking white. Or if even just like how you carry yourself, if you carry yourself, you are called like uppity or something like that. Mm-hmm. So like it's often given to like degrade Black people, because by saying you are acting white, you're saying that Black people cannot sound intelligent. Black people cannot carry themselves with dignity. And that's why acting white is some foolishness, because we don't need that in our rhetoric.
I wanted to reference the article that I read a few weeks ago. And in this article, the myth about smart Black kids and acting white that won't die was written by Janae Desmond Harris. And she states that the acting white theory, the idea that African-American kids underachieve academically because they and their peers associate being smart with acting white, and because they're afraid they'll be shunned, was born in the 1980s by John Ogbu, I want to say that correctly, an anthropology professor at the University of California in Berkeley, introduced it in a ethnographic study in Washington, D.C. in a high school. He found that when he dubbed oppositional culture in which he said that students saw academic achievement as white, the acting white theory has since become a go-to explanation for the achievement gap between African-American students and their peers, and is repeated in public conversations as it is a fact of life. Now, how did that make you feel, that thing? Because I want to say what I'm gonna say, but I want you to respond first.
Honestly, that like took me back to like all the times growing up. Like I've gotten told so many times that I act white, and I was like how? Like, what am I doing to act white? And people would always say like, oh, well, like you sound like this, or you talk like this, or your voice is different, or all of these different things. And it was something growing up that like I felt like I was too Black
Mm,
to like go into white communities or white spaces because like they're just going to see the color of my skin and be like, no. But I
yeah.
was also too white to my black peers. And it was like, oh, you can't do that and like still be down or still be with us. So like hearing that was really just like reflective of some of the things that I've heard growing up.
Yeah, for me, when I read that, it affirmed a lot of the things that I'd already known about the Black community, especially. I noticed that as a kid, because I don't have an accent, a very thick Southern accent, even though I was born in South Carolina and Columbia, I don't have a very thick Southern accent, and I speak, very purposefully, I suppose. So I say my words very clearly, or whatever the case may be. That's how I was raised in, like, just, in school, because of just the way we had to pronounce things, stuff like that. And oftentimes I would see a lot of people telling me, oh, well, he don't like, it was the scariest thing to me was when people told me, they were like, well, you sound so like different. Where are you from? And I'm like, Columbia, South Carolina. And they're like, you're from here? You can't possibly, you must have been from somewhere else. And I was kind of like, because I talk like this, I automatically must be some other race. Like, people would ask me like if I was mixed or something like that because of the way I spoke, and I was like, I'm like, since so what I'm like, so what are you trying to say? You know what I mean? And it was kind of
Right.
this back to white supremacy always, but this idea that, quote unquote, speaking Black or using Black colloquialism or whatever the case may be, that makes you, that's the definition of Black. Like, there's no other, in society's view, if you sound anything other than that particular box of communication, you are, if you sound anything outside of that, you are acting a different race, or you're becoming a different race. And I just thought that was so interesting, because I was kind of like, no, I'm Black. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. Like, I say y'all, I say stuff like that. Like, I still have influences from, my African American period, stuff like that too. But it was really funny to me, because I was kind of like, why is it the first assumption that if you speak this way or you speak in a certain way, that you have to be something else besides African American?
Right. That's like the biggest thing. And it's just like, for me, I think back to, of course, everything ties back to white supremacy, but I think it's one of those things that like it resonates in so many different levels. So you have the level of like, sometimes it comes from like a form of self-hate in terms of like thinking that like our communities can't be anything more than like where we are today.
Yeah.
And some of that is by what we see. Like, I remember going to all of these different like academic competitions or all of these different things for like the high achieving students. And I look out in the crowd and it's nothing but white folks. There will be
Yeah.
like maybe a few of Black people sprinkled in throughout there. But in seeing all of that and seeing that success is only seen by white people, especially when it comes to schools, because studies have even shown that like even with white and Black students performing the same on different standardized tests, that white people will still be seen as more likely to be able to do like advanced
Mm-hmm.
coursework and stuff like that. So it comes from just like not being able to see Black people be successful. So like if
Yes.
you are not being, if you can't see yourself in success, you're not going to think that you can achieve success at all.
Yes. And it's baffling to me how deeply rooted this is in our education system. It's, well, not baffling, but it's just, alarming. That's the best way to say it.
Right.
Alarming. Because I saw this video recently of this little kids, like, maybe I want to say 6 or 7 years old. And the Black girl was like, hey, I just took a test. I just took a test or whatever. I just got my grades back. And the white girl said, did you get an F? And then she's like, I mean, did you get a D or a C? And like, they laughed it off. But like, the little
Mhm.
Black girl was like, no, I made an A. But it was almost like, it was just like, the white girl's first instinct at that age, her first
Right.
instinct was to be like, you because you're Black, you obviously failed. You know what I'm saying? And it's that same idealism, that same connect, what is it called? That correlation that we have with that idea in our society that white people have put on the African American community, that any type of success or any type of success in the Black community is because of a white person, or because of, the quote unquote white savior, whatever the case may be. But Black people have so consistently been associated with failure. Like we can't have our own businesses. We can't uplift each other. It's always this consistent, consistent tearing down. And that little girl, hearing that from another person, you internalize these microaggressions that we hear, because that was a microaggression. And at that young of an age, Daquon, at that young of an age, we're already seeing these microaggressions that deeply root inside of us and our subconscious mind that influence us as we grow up. Because now the little girl might think, well, was it supposed to fail? Is my success not possible because of my skin color? And speaking of microaggressions, like, have you ever experienced that in this sense when it comes from white people who tell you like, oh, you sound, it's like, oh, you sound so, you know things? Oh my God, that's why you go to college?
The amount of times that I have heard, oh my gosh, you're so articulate. I'm like, am I not supposed to be? Like, are you looking at me and being like, a Black person cannot be articulate? A Black person can't go to some top private university? Like, it's one of those things that like people think you're giving them a compliment, being like, oh, you're so articulate. And I'm like, thank you, but like what you're doing is basically saying that like people who look like you generally aren't articulate. It's the whole thing, like when people will be like, oh, you look pretty today. Do I not look pretty every day?
Yeah,
like,
every day.
Did I look ugly yesterday? Like, it's one of those things, it's a backhanded compliment.
Absolutely. I mean to interrupt, excuse me, by the way. But back to, I just wanted to kind of jump on what you were saying too. My question is, would you tell a white person that they sound articulate? I haven't heard that.
Right.
And it's like, that's the definition of microaggression right there. The fact that you automatically go, oh, you know, this Black person speaking well, oh, that's so great that you can, you know, that's so great that your hood upbringing didn't affect how you spoke. But I have never in my entire 22 years on this earth heard another white person address another white kid who spoke well and said the words, oh, you speak so well, or you speak so intelligently. Right. It's always a surprise. And have you noticed that too? Like anytime you achieve things or you start to do things, you're like, oh, it's always just like, oh my God, you can achieve things?
Yeah.
You can be successful?
Exactly. And it's one of those things that like, even in like, you know, if I gave a speech or like I do some type of presentation and I have somebody be like, oh, you're so articulate. Like, I feel like a lot of times in those situations, the person is just surprised by me being able to gather my thoughts and communicate them effectively, that they don't even listen to what I'm saying. So like, they'll be like, oh, you're so articulate. And I'll be like, all right, what did I say that like made you think that? And they're just like, oh, it's just like the way you speak. So then I'm just like, so basically you just heard me and was like, a Black person can't be talking about this topic, and you didn't listen to anything I had to say about the topic.
And that is the problem. I think that people, there's this, that once again, it's one of those things where it's not overt racism, but it's like, it's covert racism. Right. Because it's not directly saying, oh, you're unintelligent, or oh, you can't do things. It's more like the fact that you, and I think that's where a lot of that that internal problem within the Black community comes from. Because when you're told by white people that you are somehow on a higher level than other Black people, that makes the community start to attack each other. That makes any sense. And I hope I'm making sense here. But it's like, you'll oftentimes see, like, especially I remember when I was younger, like, you know, it's hard to celebrate your accomplishments within your Black peers who are like, especially when you made an A on a test and like all of your Black friends have made like C's or D's or the case may be. And it's kind of like, you kind of feel almost ashamed. Right. To be like, yeah, I did pretty well. You know what I'm saying? And it's oftentimes you would see like, and I'm not even going to sit here in front because like I said before, this is an honest conversation that we're having. I have done that. Yeah. As a kid, I have done that. When I was in middle school, there was this girl who was very well dressed. She was very quote unquote well spoken, whatever the case may be. And as a kid, not aware of the effect of systemic racism, how it's had on me, I told this girl, like, oh, she's a white girl, basically. Like, she's just a white girl. She's not Black.
Mhm.
And looking back on that, it was just such commonplace. It was such
Right.
commonplace to do that to a person, to basically degrade another person's blackness because they choose to align with certain cultural, societal um, um, things that aren't necessarily associated with our culture. Just because a person wears a certain shirt or wears a certain outfit or wears a certain or does a certain thing does not make them any less of that. But because of how deeply rooted the systemic racism is within our communities and within our society, we don't even recognize how we're degrading the blackness within each other.
Right.
You know, and I mean, have you ever run into an issue with that, like even before before you educate yourself on the black experience, or were you always kind of like, like
Honestly, I've definitely run into those situations. I've definitely been that person to like have a big head and be like, "Oh, I'm better than these people because like
yeah,
I
yeah,
can achieve or like I did well on standardized tests or like
yeah,
even thinking about like I had like early high school, maybe midway through high school even, like I had such a like elitist view on college because I was like, oh, I'm going to get into like this top university and like I'm top of my class, all these different things like that. And I'm like, oh, well, like I would never go to a school in South Carolina because like they're all just like terrible. And meanwhile, like there's plenty of great schools. Like I think going to middle college was one of the things that like changed my viewpoints on how I saw colleges because like I like growing up I looked down on the idea of like community college because I
mm-hmm,
felt like that was something where it was like, oh, like that's for people who like couldn't do it. But in reality, like you get to a point to where you realize like all of this is rooted in white supremacy. All of this is rooted in this idea that like some people are inherently better than others. And I had to like make myself unlearn those things, make
yeah,
myself be able to like be like, all right, sure, I am at a great university, but that doesn't mean that other people cannot have been because there are so many different systematic barriers for black
yes.
success that I just need to be able to recognize and like studying African American studies help me see those systemic barriers.
Yeah, and I want to back up. I want to go backtrack to that comment you made about elitism within the black community. That's definitely that, and that's where the bougie comes from, or the uppity quote unquote comes
Right.
from. The reality that there because of white supremacy, there has been sort of a attack on uh, black culture within our culture, and it's the idea that like a lot of times people say like, oh, when a black man gets successful, he'll usually get a white woman, or he'll usually get this and the fourth
Hmm.
case maybe, or whatever. And it's this idea that you are in a higher place. And now we're not saying that there aren't black these certain black men, whatever the case may be, date white women. That's not what we're talking about. But the reality is there's this certain type of feeling that you're almost like a better than, and that
Right.
your own culture is less than you. And I felt, as growing up especially, I see that a lot of times I didn't realize how deeply it's affected me after when you said that whole comment about elitism. It really touched me because I remember as a kid, when I saw successful black students, oftentimes I always felt, like I said before, this shame around it, because it felt like to succeed as a black person is to be against black culture.
Mm.
So as a kid, sometimes I would, and it thankfully didn't last too long, but for a brief period of time, I was underachieving, not putting my best foot forward because I was afraid of what people would say, that I was a nerd, that I was, trying to be white or trying to be something that I wasn't. And it would be like I just wouldn't study. I wouldn't, do my stuff because I was kind of like, what it is. I'm going to be like whatever, whatever. And I didn't realize like, how deeply this white supremacist society that we live in has infected our day-to-day actions. I mean, and what my question is, thankfully my mom beat that. My mom was like, fuck that shit, motherfucker. Like, she didn't let that shit fly. But my thing is, what about that black kid who didn't have that parent?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? What about that black kid who's trying to fit in with his community because the drug game is where it's at, or the drug game is where it's popping, or whatever the case be. And again, not to judge nobody's life. My point is, in this particular conversation, that there are some kids, especially our Black youth, that go through their youth thinking that there is only one option, and that is to follow there's to follow a certain path.
Right.
And any deviation from the path that we've seen on movies, television, in our life, in these more these ghettos that were created by white supremacists to keep Black people in a certain type of situation, or whatever the case may be. The fact that these kids are seeing this only this one path, and are told that to any deviation from it is you're not being who you're supposed to be. You're acting differently.
Right. Because I feel like every young person has that need or that desire to feel like they are wanted, that they
Validated, yep.
that they can be a part of, and not being able to like have that is devastating. So at a very young age, people are going to do whatever they need to do just to fit in.
Yes.
And, you know, Marion Wright Edelman says, you can't be what you can't see. So I think like one of the things that we really need to be focusing on is making sure that people can see themselves within different communities.
Yes.
See themselves like being valued and have a sense of belonging.
Yes, I think that is definitely a big, that once again, opening those spaces to showcase Black excellence in those situations, and showcase it as not something to be ashamed of. It's
Right.
not something that you should be fearful of, because once again, it's the reality of this quote unquote, what I'll call thug culture, maybe, especially for our Black men, that, you know, it's almost this pressure to be in a gang, to sell drugs, to be a thug, or whatever the case may be. And I've noticed, and it's crazy, because I can see it now that I've had more life experience looking back. There were so many kids who had such promising academic achievements, but got wrapped up in the idea of fitting in, the peer pressure within the Black community to be a certain way, to be manly. In their terms, being manly was being a thug, and whatever the case may be, and whatever. And I think that goes back to harkens back to what we said in a couple of episodes ago about the Black community coming together to realize that there are these problems. There are these issues that we have to recognize, and we have to not tear each other down, but lift each other up and say, you know, that thug life is not where it's at. It's only going to end one of two places. And to stop glamorizing that. Now, I'm not going to blame our rappers, or whatever the case may be, because the reality is they're rapping about their experience. They're rapping about what they had to endure. And that is Black excellence in its own way, to showcase the reality of what they've been through. I just wish that there was a space opened up to let these people know that this is not something that people did by choice. This is something that people had to do. In those times, especially back in the 90s and early, like 80s, stuff like that, selling drugs sometimes the only way they could put food on the table. These were things that some people have to do. And not to say that doesn't exist now, but what I am saying is that it should not be this over glamour. Oh yes, everybody should do it. Everybody's doing it.
That's how you get all the J's and the PS5s and all of that.
That's how you do, and it's that idea, that this cycle that has it's like it went from I don't know if this is accurate or not, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Daquon, but I feel like the origin of gangs was to protect the Black community at first. Correct? Am I right or wrong about that?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
I don't know if once again, I'm not, you know, I'm just saying, I think that the origin, a lot of the in the community was to protect us from the police. Things like because it comes from like the stuff that I've seen before, but it's like that was a lot of the origin of it was to be a space to protect, and then it changed to something else. I think I might not be correct on that,
right?
But the reality is, it's gone from, in our community, it's gone from being something that people had to do to survive to being something that people do just for the fun of it. And where do you think that came from, Daquon? Like that idea that the thug life, the selling drugs, or the case, it became something that was like, oh, we should all do it now.
I think part of it is just like the types of conversations that we have surrounding it. So just like you, I'm not gonna like try to demonize hip hop culture.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I feel like, you know, we have to get to a place in society where we can validate people's experiences without
Yes.
demonizing them. Because I think that that is part of it. We demonize these certain cultures or certain aspects of a person experience. And when we put them down so much, they're not going to be able to see any way out of it. They're going to be like, well, this is what I'm already in it. My brother's in it, whatever, whatever.
Yeah, the
Like,
cycle.
it's a cycle. And when we demonize these certain aspects of somebody's experience, they're not going to feel like they can be anything other than that. So, like you were saying, like we shouldn't necessarily glamorize these certain things, but demonizing it is only going to make
Oh,
it
it's a double-edged sword. It's that
right.
reality that it was something that people had to do. And talking about that is to bring light to the reality of the time. So
Right.
that's artistic expression. But I feel like in some of these music videos and whatever the case may be, it sort of is like, I sell these drugs, look at all this money I got, look at all this. It's almost like, instead of it being, I did this because I had no other choice and think whatever, I got through that and I was able to do something else. It's
Mhm.
more like, it's almost like a step-by-step guide, if that makes any sense. It's like, if you want to succeed as a Black person, the only way that you will, or excuse me, if you want to succeed as a Black man, the only way that you will is to do blank, 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 and blank, sell drugs, get money, get the hoes, and then you become a famous whatever. And that's, I think, where that problem lies. Like you're saying, it's like, once again, we're not trying to glamorize them, we're not trying to demonize them, but we need to express it in a different way. To be
Yeah.
able to be like, listen, this is something that I had to do as a minor, as a kid, or whatever the case may be. This is what I had to do to survive. I'm in a better place now. This is not something that you want to do. This is not a life that you want. It's like, almost, I think it should be more of a teachable moment, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the problems that we have is we don't talk about these things. We don't contextualize these certain experiences. It's one of those things that like I remember having all of those assemblies where it's like, don't be in a gang, don't do drugs, don't sell drugs, you're going to go to jail, blah blah blah. And it's like that's all well and good, but that's not necessarily fully preventative because you're
Yeah.
not having a conversation about, all right, do people sell drugs? Yes. Why do they sell them? What's causing people to need to sell them? What are all of these different underlying conditions in our society that puts people into the place where they feel like they have to do this in order to make it out of wherever they're coming from or feel like they have a community?
And that's where, with that context, contextualizing it, that is where we're running into it. Because like I just said, it's almost like a step-by-step guide instead of a, listen, the reason why this happened, the reason why I did this was because of this, because of the cocaine epidemic at the time when it was out, because of blank, blank, because of this and the fourth, because I had to put food on the table, because I had no other choice. But there are other options. And if I was able to access those other options, I would have.
Right.
That is where we're having the issue. That is where the problem lies, because the reality is there isn't that space where those kids who cannot do as well in school because of these systemic racism that is embedded in our school system, that is directly opposed to Black culture and Black experiences, that directly make it more difficult for people of color to succeed within the school system. So if you can't succeed in the school system, the place that we're taught is the only way that we're going to succeed in life, there's only one other option, correct?
Exactly.
At least in the minds of kids. Now back to the topic. I know we kind of went on a little tangent there. Sorry about that. But I want to talk a little bit about moving on to code switching. So what is your experience with code switching, Daquon? How do you define it?
Code switching is a survival tactic. Code switching is just how to get through certain spaces. Code switching is something that I do literally on a daily basis in terms of just like how I present myself. Because at the end of the day, like Black people have this kind of double consciousness, as W.E.B. Du Bois talks about, in terms of like we see like our true self and like how we
Mm-hmm.
are, but we also see how people perceive us.
Mm.
So it's one of those things that like a lot of times I have to code switch because I know that, there are certain ways that I'm going to be perceived if I don't act a certain way. And in that point, it's a survival tactic. It's like when you go into like different like professions and you change how you talk, is one that's an act of code switching, or even like navigating certain friend groups. There are just certain things that I will say with my black friends that I will never say with my white friends. A, because like we don't need them to be saying that, but also B, because like there's just so many different cultural contexts that like people aren't going to understand. So they're just going to be like, why do you say that? Like, what brings you to that point? And it's like, y'all don't have the experience to understand it. Therefore, y'all will never understand it.
Yeah, for me, it's much of the same. Code switching is a survival tactic. In a lot of different situations, there's the straight gay code switching, and but it's most prominent in the Black community because of the fact that, I don't think it just stops with how we perform or how we act. I think it also moves into how we present ourselves. Back to what I was saying earlier in the episode about what we're talking about with the whole anti-Black, when people say that, if you don't have if you have relaxed hair, you have weaves, or the case may be, that's anti-Black because it's not your hair, whatever the fuck. And I think that is also a survival tactic, because the reality is, in certain spaces, unfortunately, even in 2020, having an afro, having dreadlocks, having traditionally African American hairstyles are seen as unprofessional, unworthy, or unwhatever. So we have to code switch even in our style of dress, even in our style of performance. So some women and some men and some people, like especially a lot of women in like news anchoring industry and stuff like that, they have to wear weaves, they have to wear relaxed hair because they know how they're going to be perceived if they have it any other type of way.
Right.
And that's where I feel like we also, because in the Black community, we have this really big problem with shaming each other for code switching for survival. And a lot of times we'll see that within Black women or Black men telling Black women what to do with their hair. And the reality is, and I'm not trying to get into that conversation, but the reality is women sometimes, or men sometimes, have to do these things to exist inside these certain cultural spaces. There is sometimes no choice. If you want to be successful in a certain field, unfortunately, because of the white supremacy, because of the effects of colonization, all that stuff like that, we have to understand that some people have to make these decisions. Some people have to wear their hair a certain way to survive and to actually thrive in white spaces, because we do not have a space of our own in some situations. And I think that when it comes to code switching, it's like you said before, it's a survival tactic that we have to do in order to exist in the society that tells us that our culture is incorrect.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. It's one of those things that like I am in so many different academia type circles where,
Yeah.
you have to code switch in academia because how I explain a theory to my friend is now going to be how I explain a theory to some professor or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that part of what happens when you code switch, you allow yourself to enter into the room, get a seat at that table, so then you can actually start talking the language of those people and start creating more spaces for other people. I think that's like the biggest thing when it comes to like code switching or whatever. Like, do what you need to do to survive, but also like think about who comes after you. So in these academic spaces, like sure, I can rattle off all types of different theories and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, like if what I'm saying doesn't like affect the people that I'm writing about, is it really worth writing about? Like, is it really worth using this jargon? So always get your foot in the door, get your seat at the table, but also start creating seats for more people so that we can get to a point in society where we don't necessarily have to code switch just to survive.
It's almost like making a sacrifice, if that makes any sense. And many people have to make that sacrifice to exist in those cultural spaces. But in doing so and making the sacrifice, we also have to remember to also understand why we're making it. You know what I'm saying? And I think I think it's most prevalent with people like Monique. Because for a long while she had been code switching to keep herself in a certain level of where she was. But the moment she took it down, because she was already within those spaces now, she was able to have her voice heard. She could finally be who she really wanted to be, to create more spaces for other Black women, because she knows that within the industry, Black women are disrespected, even more so. Their money is not the same. Their advertising is not the same, stuff like that. So when people were all dogging her out, like, what the fuck, like, what's wrong with her? She's blah, blah, whatever. But that's exactly what we have to do. What Monique had built a career to that point, being a certain way, acting a certain way, existing inside these spaces and taking the brunt of it. And when she finally got to a place in her career where she could actually open up that dialogue, people listened. Not well, not well, but people listened. But people still heard it. I heard it. Other little girls heard it. Other women in the Black community who are going to be up and coming actors, comedians, whatever, dancers, whatever the case may be, are going to be like, Monique stood her ground, and she blackballed. She had to sacrifice herself to do that. But now the next generation coming up knows how to stand up for themselves. The same goes for existing in these spaces. If you are a Black person that has made it up in these up in the ranks in whatever business that you're in, and you're able to make it be what it is, also remember that you're still who you are. Remember why you're doing this.
Right.
It's not just it goes back to our Black community being so focused on individuality versus community. Because if you notice in Korean cultures and Asian cultures, like if you look at their businesses, like most Korean or Asian or whatever the case may be, like people who have these spaces will invite their family to exist in the same space to help them all get up there. And it's not as prevalent in the Black community to use it for a thing, because I mean, once again, Asian people, all people of color code switch to a degree. And in that community, they have to code switch to be, they'll have the salons, they'll have the whatever the case may be, whatever. But they do so, and they also bring other people with them they also bring their people with them to exist in those spaces as well, and to also bring more room for that success. And I think that I wonder why we as Black people, we've code switched for so long. But my question to you, Daquon, is why is it that once we get to this space, or once we get to a certain level, that we seem to almost kind of focus just on us now? It's all about us.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think part of it is thinking about the difference between code switching and whitewashing yourself.
Ooh,
I think, right?
I'm listening.
I think that, sometimes when we think of code switching, we think of whitewashing ourselves. We think of just like, we have to completely assimilate to this culture to like be able to be successful. And when people do that, once they get the success, then they're like, oh, well, like I did it. I came from this neighborhood. I worked my behind off to like get here. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and I succeeded. And that's a part of the whitewashing. When you assimilate to whiteness, you also assimilate to the white supremacist society that perpetuates it. So I think with code switching, we have to remember that, at the end of the day, you're doing what you're doing to survive, but you're not like changing who you are as a person. You're not changing how you think. You're not changing like the core of your being. So like even in these spaces where I code switch, I'm still just like whatever radical minded person I am. I'm just speaking in a language that you better understand.
And that goes, and I really like what you said there, because there's this idea that once you're there, like you said, you become assimilated into that. You're like, I'm a part of this culture now because I've done it for so long. And I think it's the idea of when you use the language of the oppressor so long, it becomes your own if you're not careful. And that's where this whole bougie thing comes from, and that stuff comes from. It harkens back to that, because if you use it long enough, often enough, it becomes your own. Like you said, you assimilate to it, you become a part of it. instead of recognizing, and I always remind myself when I'm in these spaces, I always remind myself as I'm speaking like this, I'm doing this on purpose. This is not subconscious. This is something I'm doing on purpose, consciously, because I know the reality of the situation. I know that the way I talk, the way I speak, if I don't speak a certain way, that's not going to work. That's not going to be effective in this environment. And I think that it's that making sure that it doesn't slide into the subconscious where you're just like, this is who I am all 100% of the time. It's like, no, let me, I'm speaking like this. And and it's weird because every time I'm at work, when I have to speak in a certain way, I'm like, I have to do this. It's not something I want to do, I have to. And that reminds me of who I am. That reminds me that this is not who I am. This is the person I'm putting up to exist in this space successfully. But it's not who I am.
And in all of those situations, even if you are code switching, still be able to like push the boundaries, see what you can get away with so that you don't have to code switch anymore, or other people that come behind you don't have to. And we can be a true and full self without having to change ourselves in any way.
And I want to talk briefly a little bit about AAVE, African American Vernacular English. And a lot of the reason why African American people have to code switch is because AAVE is not a recognized dialect within professional cultural spaces. It's seen as not correctly speaking or not talking correctly or not being, it's not proper. Whereas it's just as significant as certain things. But I know you got something to say about this. So I'm gonna pass off to you before I get into mine. Go ahead, go off.
Ooh, is a topic of conversation because, like, as you were talking about it, I just kept thinking back to, you know, some of my English classes growing up. And, you know, I love some of my English teachers. Like, they were great, but also they would say things like, we don't speak Ebonics in this classroom, we speak proper English. And I'm like, thinking back now, like, that's part of the problem. You teach people the way that they talk is inherently wrong or bad or incorrect.
Yes.
And that creates like this hierarchy in how people speak. And in reality, like, this is not something new. This is not something that just like, oh, I don't know English, so it's like a broken version of English. Like, this is something that has been going on for decades and centuries. Like, it has grammatical structures. There are so many people now studying it and like understanding some of the linguistic components of AAVE. And it's not just slang. It like, that's the biggest thing. Like, I think this newer generation, like a young generation, a lot of think of AAVE as slang or just like TikTok languages or whatever. And it's like, no, it has its history. It's rooted in Blackness. And we need to be able to recognize this and not demonize things, because demonizing things only makes it worse.
And I think that opening up that conversation, I think that it's I kind of align it with Southern dialect. Like, within a professional English paper or within a professional, whatever the case may be, we recognize that standard American English is what is accepted as the grammatically correct norm for research papers, theses, and such. And I think that the way that we can start combating that is by teaching our educators that AAVE is definitely a language in its own. It's definitely a dialect, but just how they tell their people, like, just how they tell white people, like, hey, you can't say y'all in this because that is a dialogue. It's not it's not in grammatically in this particular, what am I trying to say? In our American Standard English, this is what we have to write in. But what I've noticed is that, especially English teachers are mostly, you know, to blame, like, mostly do this, but like, even outside of English class, they'll be like, it's not that. Or it's like things like, can I go to the bathroom? Or I don't know, can you? It's like, bitch.
It's may I, and it's
like, no, it like, again, that's AAVE, like, baby, like that's how it is. That is how we speak. That is just how it is in that particular. And I think that it's just that idea of like people forgetting that, like, you would never tell a Southern person to speak like this or to have their Southern accent. You wouldn't say outside of that particular situation, oh, you need to, it's not y'all, it's you all. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You don't
because
hear
at the end
that.
of the day, you still know what they're saying.
Yeah.
You know the message that they're trying to get across.
Or like just the reality of the situation. Real people need to recognize that once again, we all understand that American Standard English is what we write down on paper when we're doing these theses and papers or whatever the case may be. But I think that, like you said before, when people seem to demean that dialect as, oh, you're talking ghetto. Oh, girl, I don't talk ghetto. And it's like, bitch, who the, like, you know what I mean? Like, how dare you? Like, it's, huh?
The audacity.
The audacity, like the fact that it's always a demeaning when it's coming from Black people and we're speaking in our natural dialect. And it's just, like I said before, it frustrates me because it's not recognized as its own language, it's not recognized as its own dialect. It's recognized as it's always called, you're talking ghetto, or or when you hear a Black girl having a conversation or a Black guy having a conversation with a case be, and it's not just, well, hello, this is blank blank and blank blank blank. And if you talking in your regular kind of way, like, yeah, bitch, blah, 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 whatever the case may be, or like whatever, whatever, and even that, whatever, whatever, like, you know what that means. You know exactly what that means. And once again, if you were speaking to it, if in that space, people are oftentimes demeaning it like, oh, that's not how you talk. That's not the right way to talk. And it's like, no, ma'am. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. That is a correct way to speak in this particular space. And Amanda Steele said it best. It's a cultural colloquialism. It's colloquialism within African American culture that we speak. We have a certain way of speaking to each other, how we address each other. Just how some people have a certain way they address each other. This how like, oh, like we'll tall glass of water, or whatever the case may be. It's kind of like, baby, that's not real. Like that, a glass of water is not that tall. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if we're gonna go there, you know what I mean? So it's just, I really wish that we could start opening up that conversation with our English professors and our people in these spaces to let them know that when you are telling someone that how they speak is improper, that is a microaggression.
Right. Because they've been speaking like this their entire life. This is how they speak at home. This is how they grew up to speak. And there's a way to correct without, basically
Demeaning.
calling them stupid or demeaning them. Like,
Yeah.
you can, like, even if somebody uses AAVE, you still know what they're trying to say. So you can just like go back. So it's like, oh, if I say something like, oh, I ain't finna do nothing. Oh, you're not doing anything? Like that is how you correct somebody without just like completely putting it down, because you show them that, hey, I understood what you're talking about. I'm just saying it back to you to make sure that I get it, because there are some people that, don't fully grasp AAVE. But at the end of the day, for the most part, you can get some type of idea of what somebody is saying.
It's almost like, because I feel like even that is, I mean, I don't think that we have to do that either. I feel like that shouldn't be an option either, because the reality is, it's like broken Spanish. You see what I'm saying? Or like Spanglish, or whatever the case may be. That's its own dialect in its own situation. Like there's certain spaces, like when you speak to a person in Spanish and you speak the quote unquote standard Spanish, but they're like, I know what you mean, but that's not how we say it when we talk to each other. Because people can always tell, a lot of Hispanic people, a lot of people within Spanish culture, they know how to speak it in a certain way, but they also know that they also can recognize when you are, like, when a lot of Spanish people say, I know when you're using Google Translate. Or I know when you're using, you're not actually doing it the correct way, because the reality is that's not how it's spoken in everyday conversation. No one says, oh, igualmente. People say igual, or whatever the case may be, and that it's a shortened version of the same word. And people know what it means instinctually. They're not people, when I've spoken to quote unquote proper Spanish to people who are Spanish speaking people,
Yeah.
They're never like, oh, it's not igualmente, it's igual. We say it like this, blah, blah, blah. There's no correction there. I feel like we should not have to be corrected. I feel like within these spaces where things have to be said a certain way or done a certain way, we have to recognize to our youth and say, hey, listen, there is a such thing as American Standard English. And when you are in these specific spaces, this is how you have to address things and how you have to speak so that people can understand you in this way. However, when you exist in your own cultural space, or when you're around people who are not who are part of your culture, if the case may be, you should be free to speak how you will. And I feel like the whole parroting back, like, oh, did you mean? It's like, no, bitch, you know what I meant. Like, you know what I meant. If you say did you mean, that means you probably have some idea of where I'm going with it. So I feel like it's, and I understand where you're coming from, like the idea of like in those spaces. I just feel like I feel like that to me is also another way to demean it as a language, because it is one. And I feel like if we are going to start to recognize this as proper dialect as well, we have to, it's the same way of Southern dialect. We know that you can't say certain things. You can't speak a certain way, you know what I mean, in certain situations because people may not understand it, but you know how to change it up for that particular circumstance. And I feel like the same is the same issue of AAVE. It's like in those cultural situations where we have to be a certain way, we know how to do that. It's an ability that we possess, but it should not be a sense of, well, did you meant this or you meant whatever the case be. It's kind of like, no, I said what I said.
I said what I said.
I said what I said. And I am allowed to do so because this is how I speak. And I would oftentimes, and I think a lot of the reason that's why my voice has changed over the years as well, because I would oftentimes hear people telling me, don't say it that way. Don't do it that way. And it's almost in some ways erased some of the AVE that I'm aware of and within my life that I've grown up with, because people have checked me so often. So I've almost in some ways assimilated to speaking a certain way so as to not avoid confusion where I shouldn't have to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It should be a choice, not something that I have to do. But now that, like I said, because of 22 years of white supremacy, 22 years of being told that I'm talking the wrong way, 22 years of that, I've just adapted and I've just assimilated. And like I said, I've lost a lot of the colloquialisms and a lot of the AAVE that I've grown up with. Like if someone speaks it to me, I know, I understand, obviously. But when I respond, it's not in that dialect sometimes. And I feel like, in a way that has that checking people thing or trying to be like, no, did you mean, it's erased some of that. And it shouldn't, and that's my problem. It should not erase that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that in a way, like checking somebody doesn't help them, because in checking somebody, you're just being like, all right, you're doing it wrong. Do it
Yeah.
do it this way. And in that instance, you are basically saying like, you can't do this. You can't speak properly. So let me like tell you what you're trying to say. And I think that like in me kind of saying like parroting back, it's not like, oh, what you mean is this. It's more like say something that will validate that you know what they're talking about.
Okay, got you.
Yeah, not
Got you.
like being like, oh, this is how you should say it, but more like, okay, I know what you're saying. I think like even like grading a test or grading some type of paper or something like that, instead of being like, oh, this is wrong, like you shouldn't say this, this is too colloquial or whatever, be like, I get what you're saying. You have a strong argument. And instead of kind of like putting people down, you build them up and let them know that like, hey, like you can do this. Like you are communicating yourself in a way that comes across to other people.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified that, because that's what I was a little confused with what you were saying. So you're saying more so it's about validation, not so much parroting, but
Right.
validating that person as like, oh, you said blank blank. I understand what you said.
Yeah.
Even though you said in a different, I see what you're now. We're on the same page. Because I was like, sis, what you mean?
Right.
So,
Because like there's sometimes when some people like there's times when some people just don't have the words to like say it. There's also more times when somebody just knows how to say it a certain way because that's just commonplace for them. So instead of you correcting them, allowing them to see their argument being said in a different way shows them that like, okay, I say it like this, somebody would say it like that, but like we're still saying the same thing and we're still getting our messages across to each other and they are both valid.
and I really, really am sick of hearing people tell people who speak in AAVE or a slang version of English or whatever because I mean, a lot of times they'll equate speaking that way with intelligence.
Mm.
And that pisses me off.
That is
Because,
also elitism right there. Because like I can
go
speak
off, Daquon, go off.
I can speak however, like I can give you the full theoretical framework of like my entire thesis and all of this high language. But I also can talk just like how I talk to my friends. And it's not me being able to like not have the intelligence because I can obviously speak in both languages. It's one
Yes.
of those things that, you know, how you speak is not an indicator of your intelligence.
Hashtag what, Daquon?
How you speak is not an indicator of your intelligence.
And that's on period. That shit, because I would oftentimes see people telling people like Cardi B or Megan Thee Stallion or abundance of people who speak in a certain way and they're like, oh, they must be dumb. Oh, they don't know how to whatever. Like, no, their argument is invalid because they're just dumb because of how they talk. And it's kind of like, no, listen to what some people are saying sometimes.
Right.
Judge their argument not about how they present it, but the actual argument itself. And the people oftentimes will listen to people talk about these things like, oh, well, I'm not even gonna hear that because she's not talking correctly. She's not talking in the way that I need to hear it. It's kind of like, no, how about listen to what she's saying, figure out what she's saying and be like, oh, okay. Or he, whatever. Like, oh, I get it now. You're saying blank, blank, and blank. Like you were saying, validating that person.
Right.
Being like, you said it in a way that I didn't understand at first, but after analyzing, I'm like, okay, now I understand what you meant. I see what you're talking about. And I think that goes back to creating that cultural space for people to express their cultural identities as they choose. Right. And that is the problem that we have in America, is that if you do not speak in this way, your entire argument or the entire thing you have to say is invalid. It's invalidated because of how you presented it, because your particular cultural colloquialisms, and it's real funny how it's only with people of color, Hispanic people, Black people, any type of person of color that speaks a certain way. It's kind of like, oh no, baby, it's that. Oh, you must be dumb. Oh, you don't speak American English, standard English. Oh, baby, you must be stupid.
And it's kind of like, last time I checked, American English is not the originator of English. That's not the original form of English.
You just scalped a whole bunch of white people just now in the audience, right? They're like, excuse me? Say that one more time, Daquon.
American English is not the original version of English.
And that's on period. That's the real facts right there. But nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about that. But the reality is, Daquon, do you know how we could do that? Like, do you really know how we can create a space for people to do that? Like, how do you think we can? Is it possible even?
I think it starts with education. Like so many things, all of these things that we kind of grow up and develop and like have these biases for or against or prejudices for and against, all of these start when we're so young. It's so many years of being told that you don't speak right. Like that's not how you speak. You sound stupid. And we need to be able to foster educational spaces that uplift our youth rather than put them down or punish them for not fitting this cookie cutter kind of expression.
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible, just like you said, by educating people, having these conversations, opening up these discussions, and opening up the reality that when people are not existing in certain cultural spaces that require them to speak or code switch in a certain way, they should not be demeaned for doing so.
Right.
And that's the facts. The reality is when someone is outside of a classroom environment or where they're out of a whatever, they're like, if you're presenting a project, whatever the case may be, if you're out of that environment, your teaching stops there. Like that's where it stops. Like that's where your checking and all that stuff, that's where it goes out the window, because the reality is in that particular space, they have to speak a certain way. Outside of that cultural space, like this best example of it, Cardi B on Instagram can speak however the fuck she wants to. That's her Instagram. That's who she is.
Right.
But if she was in a press release or something like that, or the case may be, where she would have to code switch so that she can reach a higher mass of people, that's where she would have to maybe edit the way edit the way she speaks. And she has done so, just like all people of color do, because we understand that in those spaces, we have to speak in different ways. But I feel like the only way that we're going to create those, the only way that we are going to create cultural spaces for people to speak in their own cultural identities is by recognizing that in speaking in these identities, we are not less than. I think that the only way that's going to happen is for white people to recognize, or other, even people of color, to recognize that they are in a certain cultural space where they can be who they want to be and speak however they want to speak. And it is not your job or anyone's job to tell them how they should do so.
Right. Like, we should not have this kind of linguistic supremacy where one style of speaking is superior to others that are inferior. Like, that, again, everything ties back to white supremacy. So if you are promoting white supremacist linguistic
Points and
style,
ideology.
or putting down the cultural competency and languages that people use, like, you are upholding white supremacy, because you are basically saying that you have to speak white to be superior. If you don't, then you're inferior. And like, we just need to get rid of these notions of, you know, all of these different things.
Getting rid of that supremacy within ourselves to realize that our dialect and our speech patterns are not problematic. They are not an indicator of our intelligence. The way we speak is how we speak. The way we act is different. And I think that people need to recognize, analyze a person's argument, analyze what people are saying, listen to what they're saying, even if you don't understand every single thing. It's not your job to.
Right.
And once Amanda Steele said that shit best, it is not, if you are speaking or you are hearing someone speak in a cultural colloquialism, they don't have to explain why they're speaking that way. They don't have to defend why they speak that way. They just speak it. If you don't understand it, there's something that you don't get, then bitch, step the fuck out, because it's not your culture.
Because at the end of the day, I said what I said.
I said what I said. So I think we've reached the end of our conversation. Anything else you want to add, Daquon?
I'm good.
All right, thank you guys so much for joining us again. We really appreciate it, guys. Remember, keep the conversation going down in the comment box below. We do read the comments, we do respond. We want to hear if you guys have ever had to. What is your experience with code switching? What's your experience with AAVE, or your own dialect of speech patterns that you have within your culture? And let us know how you feel about this, guys. Don't forget to like this video, don't forget to share it. My name is Quaviondre Williams.
And my name is Daquon Wilson.
And this was the Melanin Margin, guys. See you guys next week. Bye.